batting today. So I guess in framing up the DER roadmap, and we've done a lot of sessions on that over the last month, and always keen to talk about it more. We took the view with the task force about to building a future state where customer DER can be aggregated and placed more at the centre of the value chain and integrated meaningfully into the power system. And one of the roles or the services that we envisaged DER being able to play is helping to alleviate network constraints or resolve network needs for Western Power. And so the suite of changes related to that here really seek to give life to those opportunities in a more meaningful way. And so we've sought to impose a range of new obligations on Western Power to really, I guess, help identify the opportunities for aggregated DER and other innovative solutions to resolve network needs, and give third parties the opportunity to see those opportunities a long way out and truly understand how they might provide those services, recognising that, for a new technology or an aggregated portfolio of DER, a revenue stream from Western Power to solve network needs might just be one of the revenue streams that you're targeting in your new business model to make it all work. So the initiatives we're proposing here are alternative options related. So we're moving away from the term non-network solution in order to not confuse that and network control services with those in the market. But here we're seeking to have Western Power articulate an alternative options strategy that really sets out their end-to-end investment process and a range of things that relate to that, and how new business models might emerge, and vendors that are providing those new business models might engage with Western Power. So included in that strategy will be a vendor register that Western Power will be required to maintain for these innovative solutions, and an alternative options service contract, a model contract that really sets out the types of terms and conditions that Western Power would seek to enter into with a third party to alleviate those network needs. Further initiatives are the network opportunity map, where we will seek to have Western Power provide a pretty detailed set of network information that really helps identify where network issues are, the timeframes, the types of network issues, and also the value of deferral that's at stake, to really give insight a number of years out for vendors as to where issues in the network might emerge and opportunities to resolve those issues might then be created. In doing all this, we're also proposing a demand management innovation allowance for Western Power, and that is a very limited scope that would help Western Power to do more R&D type projects, not seeking to displace any alternative option solutions, but really very early R&D type projects that will potentially allow for network costs to reduce over time, should they be able to make the leap from R&D to commercially viable solutions. So it's pretty tightly governed as we've proposed it in the code, and again, we're seeking feedback on that proposal through this. All of this, of course, links in with Western Power's broader requirements in how they invest and the tests and things that guide that investment process. So we've sought to be explicit in the new facilities investment test and really articulating how it should be applied, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But we're also seeking to provide more guidance to Western Power and to third parties as to how that test will play out. So we're asking the ERA to develop a net benefit guideline that will apply to all of Western Power's investments, and really seek to identify and guide the upstream and downstream benefits that Western Power and costs that Western Power should consider in all of their network investments, and not just those related to alternative options or where alternative options become viable. In a similar vein, we're proposing shared asset guidelines that will guide how Western Power is able to allocate revenue that they earn leveraging their regulated asset base. So where they use assets that are fully paid for by the customer base to earn unregulated revenue, we're proposing that that revenue be shared with those customers that have paid for it. And we're proposing the 30% return to customers there, noting that we're going above the similar tool in the NEM, which has a 10% revenue sharing. Next slide, Kim. So I guess as Kim flicks over to the next slide, the new facilities investment test is Western Power's sort of key investment test, and we've sought to build out the definition of the new facilities investment test to really showcase that that it should be an assessment of not just Western Power's network costs and the cost of alternative options to resolve those network costs, but a full assessment of upstream and downstream benefits, so that when Western Power makes an investment, there's an appreciation for the broader cost that investment might impose, or the broader benefits that could be realised from some other alternative investment. And potentially that our expectation is that will drive the further uptake of solutions that help support, I guess, the value chain as a whole. We've also made some further explicit acknowledgements in that, and I'll just hand to Aditi now to talk through those costs in the wholesale market that she'd like to acknowledge.
Sure. Thanks, Jai. For those who don't know me, my name is Aditi, and I'm working in the Energy Transformation Unit and responsible for wholesale electricity market design at the moment. So as Jai said, there are some explicit references to market operational costs that emerge in the wholesale electricity market that will now be taken into account in the new facilities investment test. And this is essentially to give effect to a task force decision that has been made under the energy transformation strategy that is related to the design of the new market. The main message here is that there are costs that emerge in the WEM that can be attributed to the network operator. An example of such costs would be what are being called uplift payments, which are make-whole payments to facilities if they were required to operate in the presence of binding network constraints. And because these costs can be attributed to the network operator, we need to be able to, I suppose, signal to the network operator to take those costs into account when they are considering network augmentation or reinforcement. So yeah, the main point I want to make here is that the cost of network congestion need to be explicitly accounted for, and that's what this particular amendment will do going forward. Thank you. I think at this point in time I have to hand over to James.
Hello everybody. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the facilitating of deployment of standalone power systems and distribution connected storage. As part of the electrification of Western Australia in the 50s, 60s and 70s, many hundreds of kilometres of distribution lines were installed by Western Power or its predecessor to bring electricity to many remote regional and rural customers. At present, about 50% of Western Power's high voltage overhead distribution network, which is approximately 30,000 kilometres, services less than 3% of its customer base. And many of these lines are reaching the end of their economic lives and increasingly becoming expensive to maintain. As such, this sort of leaves Western Power with the option to consider SPS as a more cost-effective alternative to replacing like for like with overhead poles and wires. But as we're aware, the regulatory regime doesn't sort of allow for the deployment of standalone power systems at this stage. But as part of the process that EPWA ran to introduce the Pilbara electricity reforms, there were amendments to the Electricity Industry Act that we have sort of jumped on board with and made a few changes around including some new definitions for standalone power systems and storage activities and storage works that will actually give the regulatory scope to allow Western Power to deploy these within the SWIS. However, to actually sort of allow further for the economic regulation of these activities, further changes to the access code have been required. These sort of changes I'll just outline now are to include those elements of the definitions for storage works and standalone power systems from the Act into the code. And we'll include, we'll sort of expand the scope of alternative options to include explicit reference to standalone power systems and storage works in relation to the capital works associated with major augmentation or for a new facilities investment. We're proposing to explicitly include SWIS as an element of a new facility and allow standalone power systems to form part of a covered network where it's deployed as an alternative to poles and wires, to which it's an adjunct and is the least cost economic option in accordance with the new facilities investment test. Next slide, please, Kim. Further to what Jai mentioned earlier was shared assets, which for the purposes of the access code, we're going to be calling multifunction assets. So with the ability now to deploy storage works within the distribution network, the concept of a multifunction asset will become increasingly much more important, particularly as these assets have the ability to be used both to provide regulated and unregulated services, which prompts consideration of how unregulated revenue from these assets that are fully funded by customers get shared with those customers. To facilitate a clearer understanding of which assets should be treated as multifunction assets and how the unregulated revenues will be determined, the task force is proposing additional obligations on Western Power and the ERA as part of the access arrangement process. In relation to Western Power, these will be a requirement to produce a multifunction asset policy as part of its access arrangement proposal. This policy must be consistent with any guidelines that are produced by the ERA, and that it should accommodate the interests of Western Power users and applicants. The policy should be also sufficiently detailed to allow interested parties to understand in advance how the policy will operate, and it should actually set out the methodology through which Western Power will determine the net incremental revenue. So this net incremental revenue being loosely the profit, and that being the revenue from all charges received by Western Power over and above the revenue if the asset was only providing covered services. In relation to the ERA, there will be a requirement for the ERA in accordance with the multifunction asset guidelines and principles to develop the process through which it can transparently reduce Western Power's target revenue for a pricing year by an amount that's actually equal to 30% of the net incremental revenue. Jai mentioned earlier that in the NEM it's a 10%, but to provide greater incentives for Western Power and to look at, you know, increasing revenue streams, we're going to put that level at 30%. The access code will also set out the multifunction asset principles and a materiality threshold. This being the level of the net incremental revenue derived from the use of all multifunction assets being greater than 1% of Western Power's target revenue for that pricing year. In relation to the actual guidelines, the proposed changes to the access code provide discretion for the ERA to make these guidelines, where the guidelines could take into account how it intends to apply the multifunction asset principles, and it may also include the process by which the ERA determines the reduction in the target revenue for Western Power. I believe that I am now passing on to Noel.
Okay, so we're doing something called the whole system plan. It'll provide a 20-year forecast of network and generation investment for the next 20 years based on 4 different scenarios. And it's all about what's the least cost investment in order to satisfy demand. As you'd be aware, the WASP is going through an extensive consultation process, and the modelling is extremely rigorous. So there's an opportunity to streamline the regulatory approach for network projects that we consider a no-brainer. So in terms of the code, you can't go putting in words like no-brainer in there. You know, lawyers get judgy about things like that. Like I noticed Matt Bowen is logged in. He'd be clucking his tongue and shaking his head. So we've come up with a different term, which is more lawyer-friendly, called priority projects. So for a project that's deemed to be a priority project, Western Power would be exempt from going through the regulatory test process. And in addition to that, down the track, when the ERA does its ex post review process for past investments, they'll only be looking at the unit cost of the project, not how big it is, and not the timing of when it's required, because that work has already been done in the WASP. So your next question is, how do you come up with what a priority project is? It's really a matter of materiality and urgency. So materiality, it's a size and risk type framework. So if it costs a lot of money, or if really bad things will happen, and if the investment isn't done, then it's material. In terms of urgency, we're really only looking ahead for the next access arrangement period. So if the WASP comes up with something that's really important but 10 years away and doesn't need any money spent now, then it wouldn't be a priority project. In terms of timing, these changes are really only for AA5, because we haven't established the business as usual governance, accountability and processes for future WASPs. So we're assuming it'll be a part of the future landscape, but until we resolve who's doing it and what process they undertake, it would be premature to lock anything in to the long term. The long-term arrangement should be established later on in the year. We're not at a point where I can give you an exact date yet. We've got a timeline there, but James is going to talk a little bit more about timelines later on. Don't want to steal his thunder. I'll now pass on to Mina to discuss technical rules change management.
So slide, please. Okay, oops, sorry, there's a little bit of a different slide to the one that I put forward, sorry. Hello everyone, some people might have heard me talk about the technical rules change management process before. There's also a couple of papers on ETU's website if you'd like some more information. So essentially the changes that I'm talking about today relate to Chapter 12 of the Access Code, which sets out the framework for covered networks to have technical rules, and for the change management process for those technical rules. Now, at the moment, it is, of course, only Western Power in the SWIS that has that is a covered network and has technical rules. So while the framework applies to any future covered networks, for the purposes of this discussion, we're just talking about Western Power. So the process under Chapter 12 specifies that basically in practice, Western Power is the only party that can submit a request to the ERA to change its technical rules. And it is also the only party that can exempt a user from requirements under the technical rules. Technical rules themselves do a bunch of things, but one of them is that it sets out the standards for the connection of assets to Western Power's network. So industry have long been, I guess, a little critical of this process. They are effectively at the moment not really able to influence the standards in which they're required to connect to the technical rules under. So the crux of all of the changes we're making here is really just a really simple one, that any interested person can submit a change to amend Western Power's technical rules to the ERA for its consideration. in addition to improving equity and being consistent with the framework under the WEM rules, we're hoping that this will also facilitate a more dynamic and responsive instrument. The technical rules has been in existence since 2007, and in that time it has changed on a few occasions, but I think it's probably fair to say that it hasn't really kept pace with the change of technology in the sector. So we're hoping we'll also achieve that outcome. The other boxes on this slide just speak to the processes. So there's quite a few changes proposed under Appendix 12 because it wasn't developed with a public process in mind. So I guess flexibility is key here. One of the things that we've done in developing this framework is had to consider, what would happen if the ERA got one change management request every 5 years, and what would happen if it got 20 in 1 year, and making sure that it was able to respond effectively. So the ERA will be able to develop bespoke processes and guidelines published for users to follow when submitting a change proposal. Importantly, it will also be able to work with applicants either before they make a formal submission or during that process. So what we're contemplating here is the potential for a pre-rule process if it was determined that the nature of rule change requests received by the ERA would make that efficient. And allowing the ERA to work with a rule change proponent to potentially evolve their application as new information comes to light during that process, which is not currently something that they can do. And that they will also be able to accept some elements of a rule change proposal and not others. So these are the kinds of efficiency improvements that we're talking about. The Technical Rules Committee is already contemplated under Chapter 12, but it is an ad hoc body, so it's formed and disbanded as needed, and that takes some time. And given the other timing constraints of the change management process, in practice it hasn't been convened on very many occasions. So we're making sure that if it's efficient to do so, that the Technical Rules Committee can become a standing body. Importantly, we're requiring the Technical Rules Committee to be providing advice on all change requests that are submitted to the ERA that are considered substantial. So it's really sort of anything more than sort of a typo level change. And we think this is really important because by their very nature, they are highly technical, and this is an expert body. The system management will also be formally included within the Technical Rules Committee, recognising the important role of the technical rules to system security and the movement of those functions to AEMO. We've got an enhanced assessment process. We've got an enhanced assessment process, so James will talk a moment about the access code objective changing, and that will include power system security and reliability and impacts on end consumers, which will then become considerations the ERA will need to think about in deciding whether to approve a change request. The ERA will also be able to seek the advice of system management, and importantly, there are much more flexible timeframes. So rather than prescribing a set period of time for each part of the process, which is what currently happens, the ERA will have 150 business days in which to manage its own time, with the exception of some mandatory minimum public consultation. I'm out of time now, Kim, but can you just flick to the next slide and I'll just point out one dot point. So at the very bottom there, we talk about the commencement date for a renewed technical rule. So that'll be 1 January 2021. Now that will allow Western Power time to undertake a review of most of the technical rules, which is currently underway, so that when it is released again next year, it will be a document that hopefully doesn't require very many changes. The exception is Chapter 5, which will be reviewed in 2021, and industry will be able to suggest changes to Chapter 5 from 1 January 2022. And that's me.